Okay, so my name is Jason Cheong-Kee-You. No one calls me Jason. There's a lot of Jasons in the company. Everybody calls me Chunky because of my last name, Cheong-Kee-You. Um, so I'm, you could say, an agile evangelist. And I'm going to, this presentation today is basically to give a history. So some of it's going to be my personal history. Some of it's going to talk about the history of Agile, and some of it's going to talk about kind of post-Agile stuff. I'm not really big on slides, so we're gonna spend a lot of time on this screen and a little bit of storytelling, and maybe I'll show some pictures. So my my story you can see here. This starts in like 1992. I go off to University of Waterloo to study computer engineering, which it's similar to electrical engineering. So the idea is that you could build a computer. So I leave school in 97. And what's interesting is that in between, when I entered school, there was like no internet. And then when I left school, the internet was a thing. So while I was in university, like the internet came about, which was really fascinating because back then, we just thought it was like something interesting. We didn't realize like, oh, the internet is going to like be this dramatic thing that revolutionizes how we work and live. It was just something kind of like fun to use, right? Hop on Mosaic and browse the web. So to understand Agile, you really have to understand kind of what came before. And people talk about waterfall. I'm going to talk about my experience of what software was like before Agile. So when I started in my first company, which was a company called MGI, 1997, Agile was not a thing. And so how did we work? When I started, they were working on a version of a product called PhotoSuite, and they were already 12 months like late. And it would be like another 9 months before we were like done that project. So imagine like a project that's 21 months like late. Like how that's inconceivable by like today's standards, but back then that was normal. And what did it feel like to work on such a project? We were all in cubicles. We had like a Gantt chart that was kind of driving the work, and we were what's in software they call a death march. So death march, like typically it's like it means that everybody knows the project's going to be a failure, and there's just a ton of like overwork. We didn't believe in the failure part, but it was constant overwork. So we would sacrifice like evenings and weekends for this. And back then, like there was no agile, there was no alternative. Like for me, that was normal. Like it didn't seem unusual. That just felt like, okay, this is what software development is like. I didn't have any kind of mindset to be able to recognize that experience as to be able to judge that experience. It just felt normal. Now, for me, it's in sharp contrast to Agile because what I considered normal back then, it was actually like very, very bad in terms of like the human consequences. I was a single guy coming out of school, living at home, and sacrificing weekends and evenings. There was little impact for me, but there's people who worked on that project that lost the relationship with their spouses and with their children. So there was a real human cost to that way of work. So let's talk about, we'll hop back into my personal story in a second, but let's talk about what was happening in the Agile world, okay? So the story kind of starts for me with Dynamics of Software Development. It's a book released by Jim McCarthy. And he was working at Microsoft, and he was kind of observing teams. And he was trying to answer the question of how do you make a great product? Because some teams would produce great products and some teams would not. And he's like, how do you actually kind of consistently make a great product? And what he found out is, what would happen is like, so, you might have like, for instance, a hypothesis is just like, oh, what you do is you just like design, you come up with a great idea. And that's what leads to great products. And what he noticed is that there was actually teams. There was a pattern that there's certain teams that just kind of consistently delivered, and certain teams that did not. So his focus shifted from understanding how to make a great product to how to make a great team. And so this expression, team equals product. So if you want to make a great product, you focus on making a great team. Now, this for me is like very, very significant. And I always say like the team is the unit. Okay. And what I mean by that is, for me, it's not the individual and it's not the company. It is very much the team that is the unit. Okay. That's the unit of like kind of performance or function. So Jim McCarthy, he did some more work, and he did some more work, and he came up with something called core protocols and core commitments. But we'll get back to that. So what else is happening? What else is happening is that there are a bunch of people, Alistair Coburn, Ken Schwaber, Jeff Sutherland, Kent Beck, who are developing a reaction to like waterfall, a reaction to kind of the madness of software development and the tremendous like human cost and just misery. And they get together at a conference, and they create something called the Agile Manifesto. So let's look at the Agile Manifesto and see what this looks like. So the Agile Manifesto, it says, we value individuals and interactions over process and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. Now, you have to understand the context in which this is given. This is people who are practitioners on development teams who are trying to renegotiate the way they're working. So what they're telling business essentially is that, look, we're going to stop whining and complaining about responding to change. If you want to respond to change, that's totally cool. Okay. But what you got to give us is you have to actually give us a lot of conversation with somebody who is like the domain expert who uses the system. Now, there's two classic ways that this will fail. If people agree to this, okay, there's two classic ways that this will fail. One is on the development side, they have to deliver, they have to execute, they have to have the skills and use the technology to support a certain way of working, right? And the other way it fails is if business underestimates actually what it means for close customer collaboration, okay? But that's all this is. The Agile Manifesto doesn't tell you how to execute. It is a renegotiation of the relationship with how we want to work between business and the development team. So let's go back to this. So these people, you can see the names on here, right? So we got Alistair Coburn, Martin Fowler, Ken Schwaber, Jeff Sutherland. Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland are the ones who essentially kind of came up with Scrum and documented and popularized it. Kent Beck is extreme programming. Alistair Coburn is something called Crystal, which probably most of you have never heard of. We'll talk about that. So Agile Manifesto was not a methodology. It was people agreeing that, hey, we want to work in a different way. So methodologies came out, okay? So Alistair Coburn wrote a book called Agile Software Development, which he talked about kind of Crystal. Now, his approach was different from, how do I want to say this? What he did was he worked at IBM and he just looked at hundreds of projects. And what he did was he asked them like two simple questions, which is, what did you do and were you successful? And he just looked for correlations. Okay. And there's a really, so he found a bunch of correlations, and the three top ones that correlated with success was frequent delivery. Okay. So did you actually deliver running tested usable code to your user community? And basically you like every 3 months. So those that went over 3 months tended to fail. Those are under 3 months. Now 3 months might seem like long or short. I don't know your context, but the scale of software development is no longer measured in months, right? But back then that was considered fast, right? So remember my story of like, we're 21 months late. Okay. So delivering software within 3 months, that was considered like very fast. That's no longer considered fast. Reflective, so there's three things: frequent delivery. The second thing Alistair Coburn noticed that correlated with successful project delivery was reflective improvement. Okay, did you get together at least once within the last 3 months? Now, once within the last 3 months, that's like, again, the scale of time, we're talking about, environments that are used to delivering like once a year, right? 3 months is no longer considered a reasonable period for reflection, right? But did you get together at least once within the last 3 months for a half hour, half day to compare notes, reflect, discuss our group working habits, and discover what speeds up, what slows down, or what we might be able to improve? And then the third thing is close osmotic communication. Okay. So he says, does it take us 30 seconds or less to get our question to the eyes or ears of the person who might have the answer? So those three things, which is, are you delivering frequently? Do you reflect? And how close are you to the people who have the answers? Okay, that's what correlates with success. Now, Coburn, when he first encountered extreme programming, because extreme programming is like another philosophy that Kent Beck came up with. When he first encountered extreme programming, he was like very kind of surprised. And the reason why is Crystal is not just one methodology, it's a suite of methodologies that can scale up or down. And so for, very kind of simple environments with small numbers of people, you can have like a very kind of tuned, very streamlined process. And then if you want to scale up, he shows you how to do that. But extreme programming was simpler than his simplest process. And that really surprised him. And the thing that he told Kent Beck was like, oh yeah, your process is simpler, but I never imagined anyone would have enough discipline to actually work in that manner. Okay, so that was kind of like interesting. And in the long run, like these ideas, like extreme programming is one, right? I'm sure probably all of you or many of you have heard of extreme programming. Very few have probably heard of Crystal. So what's extreme programming? Extreme programming. So Kent Beck, basically, he was working in a project, and he wanted to solve, all developers, the experience I described at MGI, in terms of like the human waste and the dysfunction and misery, that was like prevalent everywhere. So he was thinking like, how do I address this? And so his thought was, anything that works, anything that I see that works, I'm going to turn the dial up to 10. Okay, I'm going to turn it to the maximum. And in reflection, he says what he thought of was 10 and was actually like a 6 or a 7. Time would show how you could really like turn these things up. But so what are and that's why it's called extreme programming. Extreme programming is not like we're risky or reckless. It just means take something that works and dial it up to the maximum. So what's an example of this? So he said, what about code reviews or code inspections? Okay, so this is the idea that people write something and then afterwards you have it reviewed. So people could critique the design or the code or the implementation and give feedback and improve. Well, he's like, well, why not just do that continuously, right? So, pair programming. So you have two developers working continuously together. If it was a good idea, for instance, to have tests. So you write your code and then you have a suite of tests that verify that your code actually meets the requirements and works. Why not write the test first? Okay, so he wrote the book Test-Driven Development by Example, and he really popularized the idea of TDD. So you write the test first, run it, see it fail, and then you write the code to get it to pass. So his extreme programming is something that I'm not going to spend too much time on, but I'm going to spend a lot more time on my next presentation next week, which really focuses on like the technical skill part. Okay, so so what we know from extreme programming is software development is not just kind of like project management. Software development is software. It means you have to have specific skills to be able to execute well. And extreme programming outlined here's the set of technical practices that you kind of need to be successful, to work in this way, which is like highly iterative, very responsive to kind of business needs way, right? And that for me is what I think of when I think of Agile, okay? But that's not what Agile means in the world. In the history of the world, this is not what like Agile means. And so it's important to understand, I'm assuming like many of you coming from different backgrounds, some of you will be Agile evangelists, very positive experience. And then some of you will have maybe very negative experiences with Agile. And you're like, oh, I've seen this and it just like doesn't work, right? So I want to talk about that because I think for most people in the software development community, Agile is probably like equated with like very negative things, okay? Misery or failure. So I want to talk about that. Okay, so let's go to back to let's go back to Jim McCarthy. So Jim McCarthy started working with Michelle, and they married. She's Michelle McCarthy. So Jim and Michelle McCarthy were looking to explore this question, right? So they knew that team equals product. They knew that if you wanted a great product, you had to have great teams. And they're trying to answer this question of what does it mean to be a great team? And they spent more time, and this is what they figured out. They figured out that what makes a great team is that each individual team member, and then collectively the team, makes two commitments. And the two commitments boil down to being effective and being present. Okay, so those are the two things: be effective and be present. Now you can look up like core commitments. They're online. They publish them and maintain them for free. And there's a bunch of them. They're not just like these two, but that's what it boils down to. Okay, is be effective and be present. And if the team wants to make those two commitments and hold each other accountable to those commitments, they need support. They cannot simply like say, yes, we believe in these commitments and we're going to do that. That's insufficient for the team to actually function, to hold itself accountable to those commitments. So what they came up with were a set of like core protocols. Okay, and they published this in Software for Your Head. It's a kind of a funny book where the cover has like this box kind of robot, which is kind of inserting a floppy disk into its head. Floppy disks were a thing at some point. And I dismissed it. I completely dismissed that book because how I interpreted that book was, oh, this is like people who are not comfortable with people And this is trying to teach people how to interact with people when they can't like make eye contact. Okay. So, you know, a check-in protocol, you're allowed to say like one of four emotions, right? Sad, glad, mad, or afraid, like just so it rhymes, like, you know, or afraid, right? And then you state that, like, you know, I'm in, and everybody says welcome. And for me, I read this as like, totally the like robotic, like people are robots and they're attempting to take people who are like robots and try to teach them how to communicate with each other. And I completely missed the point. I totally missed the point. And I didn't understand because I read the book cover to cover and just dismissed it. And I didn't understand until I met Michelle McCarthy at a conference and she demonstrated check-in. And it really kind of like blew me away. And it blew me away because I realized, oh, she wasn't trying to train people who didn't understand how to interact. She was really trying to optimize for presence. And it turns out like if you follow the protocols, it doesn't mean you're a robot, and it doesn't you don't have to execute the protocols in like a robotic manner. But if you follow the protocols, you actually achieve the ability for individuals to be present and effective with each other. Now the core protocols are so there's core commitments and core protocols. And the core protocols, some of you will probably have like already experienced these in your day-to-day work. If you've been here like a week or more, you've experienced some of these things. Okay. Now there's one that you will experience more than like any other, and it's the decider protocol. Okay. So decider protocol is it's a decision making tool. And how it works, if you haven't experienced it, is when somebody thinks that we're like approaching consensus, the team's approaching consensus, then they can say, I propose. They use those magic words. They say, I propose, and they make their proposal, and then they raise their fist. And everybody who's present, they raise their fist when they're ready. And then on the count of three, you say, I support that proposal. I think it's a great idea. I'm going to go with the team. And if the team thinks it's a great idea, I'm going to totally support it. Or thumbs down, which means I have a way I can tell you how I can improve the proposal to accept it. Now, decider is it's important. It's like very significant why it's like the most common protocol you will see used. And it's because it's very efficient at doing consensus decision making, and it defeats a whole host of kind of like behavior smells around like decision making. Okay, so if somebody so some of the smells are, you know, people are just like they're all agreeing, but no one's actually like a decision's not being made. Okay, so there's just like kind of endless debate, or people think there's a decision made, but it's not clear if we actually all agree. Or people think a decision was made, but there's actually like a blocker, like not a blocker, but there's someone who actually does not buy in, but they never express themselves. Okay. So the thing about consensus is a very effective way to make decisions. And there's a whole host of decisions that you can use consensus for. All right. Now let's I want to go to let's say extreme programming. Extreme programming has values, principles, practices. Okay, if you look at these practices, which is continuous integration, energized work, incremental design, pair programming. Okay, you look at all these things, and if you were to look at, say, Scrum, which has its own set of practices, right? So stand up, sprint review, retrospective. All of those things are working agreements. Okay, so any practice is just a working agreement. It means the team agrees to work in this manner, will hold each other accountable, and will call each other out when a team member or the team collectively fails to meet that working agreement. Okay, so All of those practices, any book you read on extreme programming, Scrum, Crystal, Agile, any methodology that you read, all of those practices are context independent. They don't know about your company. They don't know about your team. They don't know about your project. Okay, so they have to be context independent. And as such, they will be the least important working agreements that your team actually has. Okay, so the most important working agreements that your team has are the context dependent working agreements. Okay, which means your context, the actual people that you are working with, the actual work that you are doing, the pains, the particular pain points that you have with the particular technologies, tools, customers, requirements, demands that you have. All right, those will be the most important working agreements. You will never read those working agreements in any book. Your team will have to come up with that. Okay, so the thing about Agile, all Agile processes, is these processes are not prescriptive. You cannot just read a recipe for how to work, how to do software development, and then think, okay, I will just follow this recipe and I will get good results, right? I will get the wonderful, perfect kind of cake. Like that won't happen. The process, the practices, and these methodologies are generative. They're not prescriptive. They're generative. Okay, so the power of Decider protocol and why it's so prevalent is because where do you want to use consensus? You do not want to use consensus for deciding where to go to lunch. I mean, you can use consensus to decide where to go to lunch, but that's not the power. That's not why consensus is powerful. And that's not why Decider is powerful. Decider is powerful for forming new working agreements with your team. Okay, so that's the power. That's why you want to be able to use have Decider. That's why you want to be able to use consensus effectively, because you will be forming and changing and tossing working agreements on a daily basis, and so you want to be able to do that like very effectively. All right, let's go back to history. So at this whole time, I'm going to conferences. I'm getting exposed. I'm reading the books on like test-driven development, refactoring, extreme programming, but I'm still working in companies and environments where I'm working in a cubicle where we're not like doing any of these things, right? And so I try to, I'm trying like, does anyone want to do pair programming? And people would kind of like, they'd say, hey, Cheong-Kee, like, look, we're pair programming because somebody was typing beside, people were working together, and I was always known as kind of like keen on Agile. So that reputation of being really keen served me well, because one time I was at a dinner of UW kind of grads, and there's about a dozen of us, and somebody at like the other end of the table said, "Hey, Cheong-Kee, I heard there's like an extreme programming shop in Toronto." And I'm like, oh, I just got up, walked over. I'm like, okay, what's the name of the company? And he goes, it's in Delaware. And he goes, I'll send you the headhunter information. I said, oh no, that's not necessary. I walked into the company. I said, who do I need to talk to get a job here? And they said no one had ever done that before. But 4 interviews later, I was working at IntelliWare. So this is 2004. Okay, so this is 7 years into my career working full time. And it's dramatic. It's dramatic what happens. Okay, so for me, I walk in at the first day, and I'm used to having like my own cubicle, like my own computer. The only thing that I have is mine is like a locker. Okay, and then they drop me in a room. They sit me down at a computer, and I just start tailoring the machine, optimized for myself, right? And Louis Richer, who was like the team lead, he just sits down and he says, "Hey, Cheong-Kee, what are you doing?" And then I go, "Well, I'm like setting up my machine." And he's like, "Well," he goes, "you're probably not going to work on this machine tomorrow. because we're rotating pairs all the time and we're always moving around. So there's no real personal machines, right? So this is like before laptops were ubiquitous, right? These were like desktop computers. And that was like my first inkling that I had stepped into something like very different than what I was used to. So that was like, wow, I don't actually have a personal machine. Um, and this was like really, really significant. And it's significant um, because one of the things in terms of culture was we were not optimized for individual performance. We were optimized for team performance. And one of the guys on the team, he would say things like, pair programming is like very unpleasant. It's really unpleasant. I don't like it, but the benefits are so overwhelming that I would never want to work in any other way. But and just to be clear, that's not my experience with pair programming. I love pair programming. But what he was articulating is that individual performance and even comfort isn't what we're optimizing for. What we're optimizing for is the team effectiveness. And the thing that was really eye opening was when we all had like all the desktops were the same, and all the shortcuts were the same. We were working on everything the same. If anyone came up with like an innovation or an improvement, and because we were like rotating daily, essentially like any improvement spread to the entire team, and it just kind of like we just kept getting better and better. And we had a saying at the company which was like, "Oh, this is the best team I ever worked on." And what it meant, like, and you could be switching teams, right? It wasn't like, oh, there was something special about the team. It was just that all the teams were just getting better, right? So like the worst team was better than the best team like 6 months ago because we were just advancing, right? Um, and that was actually something that I miss. So the technological improvement of like laptops, for me, it was like a little bit of uh, it still favors a perspective of individualism, of like optimizing for the individual, right? Where the desktop, you in some sense you had no option. If you were going to do pairing, rotating all the time, you don't have the option of like optimizing for the individual. So the first month of IntelliWare was really hard on my ego. At that point in my career, I was really earnest and I really focused on my individual performance, and I saw myself as a very competent programmer. And the thing about pair programming is it immediately showed like gaps where things that I didn't know, things where I was like not competent or fluent, where I need to kind of stop and think. And the first month was really hard on my ego. Probably about like 6 weeks, it was just like very hard on my ego. And then after that, nothing but like love and passion for pair programming. And the reason why is this: I love to learn. I absolutely love to learn. And if you look at the first 7 years of my career, where I'm just like working every day in a cubicle by myself, my pace of learning was constrained essentially to, bumping into people, um, talking with people, reading books, going to conferences. And that is nothing in comparison to pair programming. Pair programming is just learning like continuously, right? So if you value learning, and I totally value learning, and I'd say you're a software developer, the number one thing you want to look for is when can you find yourself in an environment where you're pairing, because that will beat any other means of like learning in terms of like rate. So IntelliWare was also interesting because it was founded by a couple engineers, and they had access to Kent Beck kind of early in the company, before Kent Beck had like published Extreme Programming, and Kent Beck basically set up their way of working. So they're just doing like extreme programming, and one of the things that they experimented with was kind of selling extreme programming to customers and saying, we're doing a new way of, of working. It's a methodology that we really believe in. And so you say, well, what's new about this methodology? Well, we do this thing called like pair programming. And they're like, oh, what's pair programming? Well, we make sure that no code gets written without like two pairs of eyes. And they're like, oh, this sounds like you're doubling my cost. So you're charging me twice for the same amount of like code. Anyway, so we quickly realized like selling the methodology to customers was a fail. That they couldn't understand it. So we didn't mention Agile, extreme programming, pair programming, anything. Okay, so it was very, very, very successful. Now, and we didn't change how we negotiated contracts with the customer. Okay, so contracts basically with the customer is, hey, we want all of these things. Here's a fixed amount of scope, and here's like a fixed amount of time. We want it all by this deadline. Like, can you deliver? And it's just unreasonable, right? And so absolutely, we'll sign that, and we'll agree to this, right? And how were we successful? We'd say, there's one thing you guys have to commit to as a customer. You have to put on an expert, one of your best people, okay, on our team, and they're going to work Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, as part of the team on our premises. And they're going to answer all their questions, and they're going to tell us what the most important thing is. And we're going to work on it, and we're going to deliver it. And we're like, well, no one's ever asked for this before. And it's like, well, this is how we work. You can talk to past customers and see if they're happy with us, and this is what we require. And they're like, okay, fine. And then we never like would hit the fixed scope and the fixed deadline, but it never mattered. No one cared, because they would just go to their person and they would say, well, these guys are doing amazing stuff. Like every single, week, I tell them what the most important thing is, and they just deliver it, right? So no one ever went back to the contract. So, we had figured out how to actually do customer in the room, right? Now, at this, so let's go to 2007. So 2007, James Shore and Shane Warden published a book called Art of Agile Development. And this is essentially the height of Agile, okay? They document a very kind of comprehensive and thorough and very readable. It's not pedantic, and it's not verbose, but it's a summary of the cutting edge of Agile. So it includes all of the good stuff from extreme programming. And if you want to understand like the values, principles, and practices, if you're only going to read like one thing about Agile, that's the book. Okay, so Art of Agile Development, and that's the height of Agile. Now, at some point, like at this point, kind of Agile takes a downward turn. Okay, so what's been happening? Well, the Scrum Alliance is formed, and the Scrum Alliance starts to offer Scrum certification. So if you're like an big enterprise company, and you see like the potential, and you see the positive gains and impacts that this methodology is having in the world, you're like, well, how do I convert my organization? How do I get my organization to adopt these kind of like ideas? And extreme programming, there's no certification for like extreme programming. If we go back to the Agile Manifesto, right, it says we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. So this was like a practitioner community, right? This wasn't a consulting community, consulting for like, enterprise. This was a practitioner community that were like doing things, and like it was a do-it-yourself community. You were figuring things out and kind of sharing things, right? And and it was a community. So my exposure to an IntelliWare, they were running like a monthly Agile meetup, and they would also help sponsor and help organize annual kind of Agile conferences. Um, so every month I was like seeing somebody in the community um, share their ideas of like applying these ideas. And that sense of community, um, it doesn't exist in the same way anymore. If you go to Agile conferences, there's a really interesting thing where at the last Agile conference I went to, which was 2 years ago, Todd Sharon was a keynote speaker, and there's about 1,200 people in the room, and he said, how many of you guys are developers? Like, raise your hand. And there's like 1,200 people in the room, and there's less than 10 people like raise their hand. And that was really interesting. That was in sharp contrast to my experience of the conferences in the past. And there and there was a difference in terms of like the speakers and the audience, right? So back then it was like we were all kind of like just working on teams and like applying ideas. And now you'll see like, oh, speakers tend to be like consultants, and um, people who are in the audience tend to be people who are kind of in an enterprise world and try to apply these like ideas, right? So what happens uh, with extreme programming and Scrum? So extreme programming doesn't really kind of cater to the enterprise community. But Scrum does, and Scrum is interesting, right? If you look at, um, uh, it's called, I think it's called Agile Software Development with Scrum. Okay, it talks about all the technical practices there, but what people equate with Scrum is not the technical practices. What they equate with Scrum are the project management practices, and that is what you can get certified for. You can go there and you become like a, uh, certified Scrum Master, right? And you get taught the project management practices. And those things are important, but they're important in conjunction. If you're doing software development, you have to have the software development skills. So Scrum Alliance popularized this notion that you can do the project management practices, you can take your project managers, certify them, become Scrum Masters, and then you're doing like Agile. And we all know how that worked. It didn't work well. Okay. So if you look at the people who are adopting Agile, before, they were like evangelists. They're saying like, this is the best team I've ever worked on, right? Like how, in contrast to my story, right, at MGI, where we had the Death March, IntelliWare for me was like a revelation, a completely different way of working, a different like mindset, a different culture completely. And I evangelize it to, other people, right? But people were basically saying, they weren't saying like, this is the best team I ever worked on. They're adopting Scrum and they're saying, this kind of, it sucks less. It sucks a little bit less, right? So this divide kind of happens in the software development community, where you have people who are doing like extreme programming, and that for them that's what Agile equates to. And then you have a whole other set of that are experiencing Agile, but not with any of the kind of technical skills and the technologies to kind of back up executing well in terms of software development, but the project management practices in isolation, and sometimes not recognizing the contract, right? The contract says the team will actually provide the skill and the technology to be able to work in a rapid, iterative manner and a sustainable manner. And then the business will provide sufficient communication, right? So Alistair Coburn talked about osmotic communication. We like within 30 seconds having access to the answers that you need. And so, there's one way to fail, which is like, yeah, the team doesn't have the technical skill or know-how. And the other way is like the business doesn't actually provide the expertise, right? So there's this fracture in the community. And if you have experience with like Agile, and it's in some sense like tainted for you. Um, like I don't want you to focus on Agile. It's not necessary. I want you to focus on what it means to be like a strong team, and what it means to do like software development effectively. And if you don't have an experience with extreme programming, then I invite you to like really kind of embrace and experiment with these ideas. So let's talk a little bit about how this team operated, because I talked about a cultural shift in terms of pair programming and kind of like the ego there. And we were developing in iterations and developing like once every 2 weeks um, we would have like working software and do a demo. But what's the actual experience of being on like a strong team? The thing I want to express is, before, when I was having like, one thing I can see is, are meetings effective? And what I mean by that is, do people tolerate ineffective meetings? And when I see how we function at IntelliWare versus how like I would function before at like previous companies, one thing was interesting. There's a behavior where if a meeting starts and the person who's supposed to chair that meeting like hasn't showed up, previously, that meeting would just like, we would just sit there and wait. And if that person didn't show up, we would just like clock in the time and the meeting simply would not happen, right? And in IntelliWare, it was absolutely fascinating that when a meeting started, it doesn't matter who was present. There was no designated, like the team lead has to facilitate or has to start this, right? Whoever was present, somebody would just step up. And this isn't like not an unusual group of people in the sense like, this is just your regular developers. So you have an odd mixture of people, and some people are introverts and some people are, it's a regular group of people, developers. They're not social. They're not especially like interested in like limelight or taking charge. But it didn't matter. People would just make sure, like, we had to run the meeting. A facilitator, that role has to be fulfilled. Who's present? And somebody just fulfills the role and it moves. So this idea of like this separation between kind of title and role, and just recognizing roles needed to be filled and anyone can fill those roles, was very kind of eye-opening for me. So we've talked a bit about Agile and how Agile is just a reaction to ways of working before that were like kind of like ineffective, and actually just kind of like with huge, I'd say like suffering, right, for the teams that are working in that manner. And we've talked a little bit about how Jim and Michelle McCarthy uncover a way that of like really kind of almost like a prescription that if you want to make a good team, they actually have to make certain commitments to each other to be effective and present. And then they have to enforce those commitments with a minimal kind of set of protocols. And we talked about one protocol in particular, which is Decider Protocol, which is a way of using consensus to really form like new working agreements, which are going to be your context specific like working agreements with the team. Okay, so this is an engine. And we talked a little bit about how this could break down, right? Either you just don't have sufficient contact with like domain experts, or your development team lacks kind of like the technical skills. Now, I want to talk about another pattern. And the pattern I want to talk about is, let's see here. So 5 dysfunctions of a team. So 5 dysfunctions of a team is also trying to like figure out how do you get great teams, right? And it comes at this from a different angle. And what it says is there are 5 things, obstacles that teams have to get through, and you can't skip the obstacles. So the and it talks about them from like a dysfunctional perspective, right? So dysfunction means you have an absence of trust, a fear of conflict, a lack of commitment, avoidance of accountability, and inattention to results. And the book says some interesting things, which is you can't focus on results if you don't have any of these things below, right? So focusing on results when the team lacks accountability, commitment, conflict, or trust um, is like a waste of time. You have to work like from the bottom, like upwards. And my observation about this is that um, not all of these things are important. Okay, I feel my experience is that um, these 3 commitment, accountability, results, they will come if teams can tackle trust and conflict. But that's where the challenge is. For many teams, what ends up happening is teams establish a little bit of trust, and then they get into conflict, and then it does not go well. And so they back out of that, and they maintain an environment where they don't have open communication. They are not unable to kind of share concerns. They're unable to kind of challenge each other. They don't engage in kind of uncomfortable conversations. So the important thing is to figure out how do you get through like these 2 parts here. Okay. So one is you have to have a clear picture of what it means to be like not dysfunctional, but to be really functional at these like levels. Okay. So you can see, I pulled this image from somewhere, but someone has kind of summarized these things, right? So be human. So how I like to characterize like high functioning at the trust level. So a team that does not need to, they do not have an absence of trust. Okay. How I characterize this is the team has goodwill that is battle tested in shared failure. So if you do not have that, you do not have trust. So if the team's never failed together, you haven't had opportunity for trust yet. Now you don't have to seek failure. You don't have to seek hard for failure. Failure happens like every day. Any meeting you go to, there's going to be part of the meeting which sucked. The whole meeting might suck, right? If you join a new team and you're working with people you never worked with before, and chances are the meeting's not going to go well. So meetings not going well is not an opportunity or not a sign for like, oh my God, this is terrible. This company is like broken. It's an opportunity to build trust, right? So when something goes poorly and you have an experience of shared failure, how do you build trust? The first thing is just like acknowledge it and say, you know what, that wasn't great for me. How was it for you? And we just recognize like, oh yeah, this wasn't great for us. And well, how can we do better, right? And the goodwill is generated in battle test and shared failure because people could react poorly, right? In failure, you can see people saying, "Oh, you're at fault. You should have been more prepared for this meeting. Like, why weren't you more prepared?" Right? So that's not demonstrating goodwill. So if people fall into kind of like blame or, why that was painful, it shouldn't be painful for me. I need things to go better for me, right? So if people demonstrate that they're looking out for their interests or they're blaming other people or putting the responsibility on other people, then that's not actually demonstrating goodwill. So what you do is you just assume people had the best intentions, and then you just be open and say, how could we improve on this? How can we redo this meeting tomorrow? And how do we make sure like it goes better than today? And every failure, like do not dread your failures. Every single opportunity is an opportunity to build trust with those people. Just openly admit that didn't go well, and how do we do better tomorrow, right? So another tip is we're very tribal and simple creatures, okay, very primitive creatures. Part of our brain it operates in a like very strange way, and it turns out like who your tribe is who you eat with. It's a very simple thing. So if you eat with somebody, your brain thinks, oh, they're part of my tribe, right? So you find opportunities to sit down and have a meal with like another person. So there's people who are very savvy about this and very aware. And one of the experiences that I had with a team that's like very aware about this stuff is before the team had like started working, we all sat down and we had a meal together. We invited people over, somebody cooked, and we just told stories. And oh man, there's one guy who was just like incredible storyteller, right? He's just from like the South, and he's got this accent, and he's just like classic storyteller. And he had his like belly laughing that evening, and it's simple, and it's you could think of it as like a manipulation or a trick, but I don't think of it that way. It's a trick if people are doing something and you're not aware of it, and they're doing it because they want a certain outcome out of you, right? But it's not a trick when you're like, you realize like, oh, we're doing this openly as a team, and we're doing this together for ourselves, right? Because we want to build trust. Okay. So be human. Now, trust is a challenge, but that's easy compared to conflict. Conflict is like the challenging part. And the conflict is two people or a bunch of people, they just do not agree. They have different perspectives. Okay. So what you want is, what does like the positive of this look like? Now, whoever put together this picture put demand debate. Now, demand debate is a very, very good behavior. But for me, it's not sufficient for capturing what it feels like when a team does not have a fear of conflict. Okay. What a team has, what it feels like when they have no fear of conflict is what I call like catalytic conflict, which means that you have different perspectives, and in the engagement, in the discussion that happens, something new is like discovered, right? New possibilities are uncovered, and you actually end up with like much more like better creative like solutions. Okay. So catalytic conflict is the belief that you can bring disparate sorts of perspectives and people, and if they understand how to do debate, if they understand how to actually engage each other's so that they can mine the valuable things of people's perspective, then you can actually create something totally new. And then if you understand that, if you know that that's possible, you will demand debate. Demand debate just comes out of the consequence of this belief that, oh yeah, conflict is not something that is bad. You can actually do it in a manner so that you can actually generate like creative solutions. So that's not sufficient. You need tools, right? So I gave you some tools to think about, like very simple tools, but hopefully they have an impact for trust. Eat together, assume best intentions of people, acknowledge when things don't go well, ask people to work with you to make things better. Okay, for trust. So for conflict, what do we have in our toolbox? So the basic thing for conflict, and these are just like simple things, but one thing is don't shy away from argument. Okay, if you believe something strongly and it's important to you, argue it. Argue for your belief. Argue as if you're right. But here's the thing, you have to listen as if you're wrong. When it comes time to hear people's responses, assume you're wrong. And assume like best intentions. Assume the most charitable interpretation of what you're hearing. And then repeat back your most charitable interpretation of what people are saying. And it's amazing. I'm like actually really terrible at this, okay? But I work with people who are really good at this, and it makes me better. So even though I'm terrible, oh man, without these models, you'd not want to work with me. So, um, but they make me a better listener. And the people who, you only need one really good listener on your team. If you don't have a good listener on your team and you're hearing this, like, you can be, there's nothing stopping you from developing these skills. You can be a good listener. All right. There's books on this stuff, right? So if you want to read about this, you can read about like crucial conversations, nonviolent communication, words that work in business. I'd say that's probably the best one for bang for the buck. It's a short one. It's very focused on like work. Very practical, not a lot of theory, right? So the thing about conflict is we work in environments where people there's complex. It's very complex. You have different people with different backgrounds, different things to bring. And if you do not crack this nut of conflict, then you're just destined to working on a team that its best could be like, it kind of is okay. It's mediocre. And you'll never be an evangelical about your kind of team. And that's not what I want for you. It's not what I have now, and it's not what I've had in the past, and it's not what I want for anyone. I want people to be to experience like what it means to be in a great team. So if you get these things, then you will push for more from your team. You will push, once you get through those two challenges, the rest will be in some sense inevitable, because you will not be comfortable with just catalytic conflict. You're going to push for, let's make commitments to each other. Let's hold ourselves accountable, and let's achieve results. So one more thing about catalytic conflict, or a couple more things. So catalytic conflict, there's two responses when you find yourself locked into like a kind of a disagreement. Okay. And disagreement's not bad, and people having strong stances is not bad. It means people care, and they're passionate, and they believe something's at stake, right? But you need to have tools to be able to make progress, and you want a positive feedback cycle with respect to conflict. If you get a negative feedback cycle, you're just gonna like, oh man, that was painful, and I don't want to do that again. But if you experience something positive, you're gonna seek out conflict again, because you're gonna like, oh man, I have tools to actually like mine this for something good. So there's some more that I want to say. One thing is, if you think that your thing is kind of cheap and there's very little cost, ask for an experiment. Like, reduce the commitment. People sometimes think, oh man, you're asking me to work this way forever. And just say, hey, could we experiment with this today? Could we experiment with this for like the next iteration, the next week, the next month? Would you be willing to experiment with this? If you find yourself on the other side, where somebody really wants to try something, you're like, no. See if you could change this and say like, okay, look, I want to support you on this. Could we simply experiment with it and see what you're willing to do? If you're willing to experiment with it for like a day, a week, a month, just say that. Saying, I'm not sure how this is going to go. I think we should experiment with it and then evaluate. Okay. And then you can say yes to the other person. Another thing to do is just like disagree and commit. This is very important. You need to realize that for a lot of your decisions, the most important thing is your ability to make the decision in a timely manner is much more important than getting to the right answer. Because if you can actually like make a decision and then learn and pivot, then that is much. And some software developers have this mindset where it's like, if they notice like after 10 minutes of discussion, they're like, oh, I'm going to go with your method, because we're going to actually learn more if we just see it in code. Like, let's just go with your way, right? And it's unimportant to kind of like try to win an argument where we spend like half an hour debating this, where we could have tried out both ideas in code within that half an hour where we're debating. Okay, so try to realize like there's a cost to not making the decision. So see if you can disagree and commit. Okay. The third thing is use use decider protocol. Use consensus for forming working agreements. Consensus is a specific way of doing decision making. There's other ways of doing decision making. The other ways of doing decision making, there's a whole host, but basically, you can have decision making where person with the biggest job title or biggest salary makes the decision in the room. You can have decision making where loudest person in the room makes the decision. Okay. You can have democratic decision making where it's like majority. Consensus for working agreements is the most effective. The other forms of decision making don't actually lead to the best way for forming working agreements. You want to make sure everyone's kind of bought into the working agreements, right? A working agreement means this is how the team is functioning. You don't need to use consensus if it's only like one person involved or impacted by the decision. They just need to say, oh yeah, whether they're going to do it or not, right? That doesn't require consensus, right? But when the whole team has to agree on like this way of working, you want everyone like bought in, and you want to be very explicit if anyone thinks like, no, you have to modify this for me to like buy in. So be explicit about your working agreements. If a working agreement is not working for you, then toss it and use consensus to toss it. Say, I propose that we ditch this working agreement. We're no longer doing this. It's actually, if we were to do this, it would no longer serve us well because our context has changed. So I propose we get rid of this working agreement. Right. So be explicit about like modifying, forming, and ditching your working agreements, and use decider protocol, use consensus. So so let's continue with our narrative. So I leave IntelliWare in 2009 to go to a company called Courtyard Group. And it's really funny because when I think about this, it's like, I don't even think of it in terms of companies. I think of like, I was leaving the Health Watch team to go to the patient registry team. Because my identity is, when I say team is the unit, it's part of me is because it's like, that's actually how I feel. Like my identity is so tied to my team, right? And so patient registry was a team that worked in Manhattan, in New York. And they were tasked with collecting data for patients with diabetes in the hospitals across New York City, and making sure that diabetic patients were like pulled in and managed so that they never got to a stage where their diabetes led to like really expensive and very impactful kind of harms or developments. So, in the States, it's not like Canada where everyone's got a family doctor. If you get diabetes, no family doctor, you could eventually end up like with limbs that need amputated. You go blind, or you need dialysis, right? So we were working on this patient registry team, and from there, I worked with. So this is a company that didn't do software development. It knew nothing about Agile, and it was really exciting to bring the Agile culture to like another company. And so from there, I became like an Agile coach, and then this part of my career is just kind of like exciting because I'm like hanging out with a whole bunch of like Agile coaches. Like these are, just some of the best people in the world in terms of expertise, and learning from them and working with them. Now I have to talk about post-Agile. So Agile, this is the height of Agile. 2007, this is where kind of like the story of Agile ends, and like kind of like other things kind of break out. One is like a reaction to what's happening with Scrum and all of the failure of people trying to apply Agile without adopting any of the technical skills or practices or technology. And so if you look at software craftsmanship, you can see, not only working software, but well-crafted software, not only responding to change, but also steadily adding value. Not only individuals and interactions, but a community of professionals, not only customer collaboration, but also productive partnerships. So this is in some ways unimportant. And what I mean by that is like, I don't think like, oh, you need to like figure out how to shape your team around this manifesto. But you need to recognize like, oh, when you see this, what is this coming out of? Is this like an update of the Agile Manifesto? No, this is just a reaction to kind of like Scrum failing in the enterprise community. Right? You can also see things like modern Agile. So this is Joshua Kirievsky. And this is also just like a reaction to kind of Scrum failing the enterprise community. Okay, so what he says is like, look, you want to focus on 4 things: making users awesome, make safety a prerequisite, experiment and learn rapidly, and deliver value continuously. Now, all of the things he talks about, they're all valuable, right? But again, in some ways, it's like, oh, you just like software craftsmanship, you can ignore. If you see it as inspirational, fantastic, but you don't need to build your team according to these like ideas. The things that you really need to build your team on are, I would say, core commitments and core protocols, okay, and extreme programming and Scrum. The project management practices are sound, like sprint review, stand up, retrospectives, sprint planning, like those, and release planning. Those are sound practices, all kind of orthodox Agile. Make the commitment to be effective and be present, and use the core protocols. Use Decider protocol, right? Form working agreements. Those are going to be the bedrock. Focus on catalytic conflict. But you have to understand, when you see these things, what does this mean? Like, do you think of it as like, oh, is this the updated Agile? Should I be like taking these things? You can use this as a source of inspiration, but realize they're mostly reactions to the failure that's happening in Scrum, right? It's not a replacement. Okay, now there's 2 movements that you need to be aware of that are post-Agile. And that is like DevOps, or continuous delivery, and lean startup. So around 2000, 2011, 2011, a friend of mine said, hey, I'm going to Boston for Lean Startup Machine, you should come. And so Lean Startup Machine is like a weekend conference. You hold it from Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday. And you basically, people make pitches on ideas. You form into groups of roughly 6 people, and then you try to build the idea. You give a presentation, and then they select winners, right? They have a panel that like awards winners. So it's like a hackathon or a startup weekend, right? But Lean Startup Machine has a twist. And the twist is, in a hackathon or startup weekend, you're just left to your own devices as to how you're actually going to execute. Lean Startup Machine says, we're going to actually give you tools to bootstrap how to do lean startup. And you're going to exercise those tools in which to actually like execute. So what does that look like? So I went there, and somebody pitched an idea for like a website for parents who homeschool their children. And I signed up for that team. There were 6 of us. 5 of us were developers, and 2 of the people had worked, like knew each other before, right? So the other 4 never worked with each other. Okay. So The problem that was kind of in the pitch is, you, as a homeschooling parent, you don't know how to put together like a report card that are going to like satisfy college. You don't know how to get materials or curriculum for your kids. You don't know what the kind of bureaucratic forms you need to fill out on an annual basis for the government. And you don't have access to like other families, parents and children who are also doing this, so you can socialize your kids. Okay. So at this point, you have to understand that I'm coming with the perspective of developer's perspective, and I'm thinking the fastest thing we could do, the absolute fastest thing we could do, is build this. Like, 5 of the 6 of us are developers. We could build this in the weekend, and then we can just demo it, and it's going to be done. Okay. And that was my mindset going into this. So what the facilitator said is, we're going to give you this validation board, and you're going to write down who you think the customer is. And this is not your customer. This is a hypothesis. And you're going to put down what you think the problem is. And then and that's a hypothesis. And then you already have a solution, which is again a hypothesis, but they put a big X in the validation board, and you're like, you can't put a solution in. What you have to do is validate your customer problem hypotheses first. So what is your riskiest assumption? And they said, you don't have to work too hard on this. We're going to tell you. Does this customer actually have this problem? That is your riskiest assumption at this point. So what is your experimental method to validate this assumption? And what's your success criteria? So they said, well, at this point in the game, when you know nothing, you're going to benefit from just doing customer interviews. Go and talk to people. Get out of the building. There was a big horizontal row in the validation board that just said, get out of the building, right? So talk to homeschooling. We said, we're going to talk to 10 homeschooling parents, and we want 8 of the 10 of them to say they have these problems. Okay. And we're confident at this point, right? So what actually happens? What we did was, we went into Craigslist, and we found, we posted a post for selling homeschooling supplies. And we just put a phone number, and we also looked at people who were selling homeschooling supplies on Craigslist, and we also went and found them and called them up, right? And we started asking questions. Now, what was interesting is, I was very anxious about, oh man, like, we're just being dishonest. Like, we put a post and we're like lying, right? And what was interesting is, we told people at the very beginning, like, look, we're not actually selling homeschool supplies. We're actually looking to put together a solution for homeschooling parents, and we're trying to collect information. And people were very gracious. They were very interested in talking with us. And sometimes we'd have problems like getting them to stop, because they just wanted to share. They had so much expertise on homeschooling. But no one was upset by the deception, right? And the first 2 people we talked to, like, invalidated like in the same way. They just started like invalidating our ideas, right? Our problems. So what did we learn? We learned that report cards, there's actually like an existing solution for like tracking report cards. Somebody already thought of it. We had not encountered it, but other people had already. Materials and curriculum, not a problem. People already had solutions. The first 2 people we talked to had the exact same solution. Government forms was a problem, but not across all states. Some states had no regulation, so there were no forms to fill out. Other states, it was very painful. You had to fill out annual forms, and it was like a pain to like find these forms and how to. And then socializing children, again, was like not a problem. So 3/4 of our problem hypothesis was invalidated. And this is on a Friday night. And this was like a revelation to me. We had like written no code, and we had invalidated like 3/4 of our problem space without writing like any code. And I didn't document the other kind of like 5 iterations because this is not what we actually use. This is just kind of like from memory, right? But essentially, this put a strong mindset. I want, and I can see it happen with like all the attendees, right? People come in, and if they're salespeople, they want to sell. If they're designers, they want to design, right? And if they're developers, they want to write code. But all of us left as like scientists, which is like, what's the quickest way I could validate the most important, my riskiest assumption? And in software, writing code, developing the software is usually the most expensive way to validate, right? So they gave us a set of tools for before writing software for how do you actually like validate. But the most important thing is just the mindset. If you actually have that mindset, then you will just like seek, you will just be hungry for faster ways to validate your ideas. Okay, after Lean Startup Machine, I'm like very interested. So I'm like, where did these ideas come from? Well, they came from Lean Startup. Eric Ries publishes a book. And what he says is he has this story. And the story is he's on a team. He's hired as a consultant. Oh, Kanban. That's a little typo there. Kanban. So his story is he's hired as a consultant to kind of assess and consult on how a team's working. And they're interested in applying like lean startup ideas. And so he goes to a developer and says like, hey, I see you've got a backlog in progress done. Okay. So you're done column, you just move this story over. How do you know that that was valuable? And the developer's like, I'm not sure what you're asking. Like, it's done. Like, I'm not sure what you're asking. And he's like, well, how do you know that that was valuable? How do you know it actually didn't decrease value for the users of the application, your customers? And he's like, oh, well, the product owner told me what to work on. So, I trust them. So he goes to the product owner and he says, the team just moved this work to done, this feature. How do you know it was valuable? And he's like, well, I've been working in this domain for like, 15 years. Yeah, he goes, but how do you know, like, if it actually decreased value, or, how do you know it's not more valuable than you imagined? And so the guy goes like, look, Eric, I don't know. Like, you're the consultant. Like, you're supposed to tell me how to improve things, right? And so Eric says, well, look, just put in a column. Okay, so you change your done to built. Put in a column that says validated. And then like, what happens? And so it's like, well, what does it mean for something to be like validated? Well, have your team validate it. It's like, well, how? Well, just tell your team that they have to validate it. They'll figure out how. So they do this, and the team's like, well, how are we going to validate this? So they're like, well, I guess we got to talk to customers. So they start talking to customers. Now, the developers don't like this. So they figure out how to like apply some automation. And what they do is they start doing A/B testing, and they start doing they automate. They actually develop their pipeline. They do cohort analysis, and they automate collection of the data, and they actually have a pipeline so that they can see what the impact of a feature is on actual like revenue. And so something really interesting happens, which is they release a feature. So there's the feature after they created this pipeline was anonymous login. So this is the ability for people to use your service without actually creating a login or registering, so that they can try it out. And so deferring login. And everyone's thinking, oh, this is a standard practice. This is going to increase our adoption, is increase people trying out our application, our service. And so we'll see our numbers increase. And what ends up happening is they release the feature, the data shows zero impact on revenue, and then they just delete the feature. So that's fascinating, right? That's really interesting. So they started with like, validating, and then they figured out how to like automate this. And then they actually were collecting data based on what they cared about, which was like revenue. And then they can see the impact of every single feature. And then things that were not valuable, like those have a cost, right? I imagine every single application, including the ones we build, every single application, 90% of those apps are useless. And yet if you're not collecting data, you can't actually tell which parts are being used or not. You can't actually identify the ones that are not valuable. So you don't know how to delete them. So what else is worth sharing about lean startup? So lean startup has this idea of build, measure, learn. And the idea is you build a product, you take measurements on the product, you collect data, you analyze the data, you learn, which generates like ideas. Okay. Now, this name, build, measure, learn loop, is absolutely terrible, because what this looks like is you start with build, you go to measure, and then you go to learn. And in some ways, starting with build is like always the wrong thing, and you just don't measure and you don't learn. You have to start with learn. You have to say, what is it that I want to learn? What is it that I want to learn about about how I'm working, about work that gets delivered? Is it the impact on my revenue? So you have to start with that question, because that is the forcing function for measuring. If you start with build, afterwards you're going to find weak ways of measuring. Like you're simply not going to have strong ways of measuring the things that are important, because you didn't think first about what it is that you actually wanted to learn. So the key idea from lean startup is you start with the learn. What's the most important thing that you want to learn? Then that drives what you measure. And then from there, then you build. Okay. Because the thing is based on like, if you start with, if you're learning, what the fastest way to build probably is code. So, developers always assume, like I'm happy to write code. I have so much expertise on writing code. It's like fun. I get to exercise all of my skills and training experience, right? There's an example of this where Kent Beck's got a good example, because he's very much kind of like has a reaction to lean startup. And his thought is, he says, if you're just working on an app at the start, and the point of engineering is not to build software, the point of engineering is how to provide a solution so that the fastest solution, the minimal solution, so that you can learn. So if you're just starting up like an app and someone tells you, okay, well, we need like a payment gateway. Well, why do you need the payment gateway? What are you trying to learn? Well, you're trying to learn if anyone's going to buy the product. So, then building the payment gateway is not what you need. The minimal measurement you need is you just need to know if someone's going to hit the buy button. So what you need is you just wire the buy button to like email, right? Somebody hits buy and it sends you an email. That's it. That's all you need. You don't need a payment gateway for that. So is the engineer who builds the payment gateway and takes, I don't know, like 3 weeks to build that, are they a better engineer than the engineer who takes 1 day to just wire up the buy button to email? Well, from Ken Beck's perspective, no, not if the goal is to move through this build, measure, learn loop as rapidly as possible, right? Okay, so what else does Eric Ries says? Eric Ries says, he talks about accounting, and he says, conventional accounting comes from like Ford, when we were building manufacturing, like industrial revolution starts and you have like factories that come out and you need to assess the performance of your factories. So conventional accounting allows you to make assessments and comparisons and see how our factory is performing. So, these are just made up numbers. They're no way realistic, but I can see the return on investment of these factories. I can see like factory C is like, their expenses are really low. Revenue is ridiculous. And factory B is like their expenses are very high, right? So I can see and compare how these things are doing. I can ask interesting questions, right? I can get it at a glance. I can see where I want to kind of investigate, okay? Now, conventional accounting does not work in the context of kind of startup, because what you have is you have these two teams across like 4 months, and conventional accounting tells you this: I have 0 revenue on the first month. I have fixed expenses for my team, and my ROI is I lose it, like I have nothing, right, for my investment, and month after month. So I can't distinguish between these two teams, but these two teams are like very different. One of these teams I want to invest in, the other team I do not. Okay. So he talks about innovation accounting. So innovation accounting is the idea that the unit of measure is not like revenue. The unit of measure is what did you learn? That's your unit of measurement. Is like, and it's definitely not features, because both of these teams could be cranking through features. It's like, what did you learn? And so what he says is, for whatever you're working on, you can create like a pipeline here, and you have so this pipeline, how do you read this is, 100% of my users, they register and they never get beyond that. Here it's like 70% of my users never get beyond registration, and then 30% never get beyond logged in. Okay. So this always totals to 100. Okay. This is showing 17% of users never get beyond registration, 75 never get beyond login. Okay. And then what you want to do is you want to figure out like whether they pay. And then in fact, another row, if you're clever and savvy about this, and you can do this, you can estimate like the lifetime worth of that customer, right? And you can track that. So, but just doing this alone, just measuring, is not enough. Okay. This is not enough. This is not learning. Okay. You may have learned, but learning means being explicit about your hypothesis and about your intervention, right? The experiment that you're going to run, and making a prediction, and then looking at what actually happened. And the thing that Eric Ries says about this is it doesn't kind of go this way. Like the picture I'm kind of drawing out is, the numbers just kind of progress. Okay. He goes, what ends up happening is you just get a hurdle where things aren't working out, and you're actually forced to stop generating ideas, and you have to actually talk to people. Right. And all of this is just a forcing function for you to be able to gain like strong self-awareness that your ideas are like not as valuable as actually contact with reality and developing like intimate knowledge of like, your customers and your customers' world and problem. Now, I want to talk, like, this is in the context of startups, but startups in kind of like business to kind of consumer world, right? And we don't live in a business to consumer world. So how does this apply to us? Well, 2 years ago, my team OSP1 works in production scheduling, and 2 years ago we were working on production scheduling, and we had a release plan, and we were months into developing certain feature, and months after, like we had months charted out of like where we were going to go, and we had a book club on a book called Lean Enterprise by Jez Humble, and Eric, who was on the team at the time, he was really had this validation mindset, and he's like, how quickly could we validate some of this stuff? And he built an MVP in Hackday in 1 day for some stuff that was like some of our fundamental assumptions about how our application was going to work. And we were so impressed. We're like, oh man, we're so excited to demo to customers, because we're going to validate all of our good ideas, right? And after he did that demo, This is what happened to our release plan. So this is our release plan, okay? And so we had like months of stuff planned, and this is all work that we have not done, and I don't know if we'll ever do. But that demo invalidated it. It not only invalidated months of work coming up, it invalidated months of work that we'd already put in, right? And he did that in like one day, and that was like eye opening. After that, we started doing like prototypes and demos where the team would say, where's our stuff which is risky, where we don't have confidence, and can we actually put together in a day or two max something that we could show to the customer and get feedback. That and so we saved, like, we would put stuff out, and then we would invalidate either that technically it was just not like feasible, it was going to be too costly, or this wasn't going to work. We could totally tell during the demos with the customer that the experience, and we would see, oh, here's what we could do instead, right? So that's something we have in our toolbox. If something's dirt cheap, we don't bother prototyping it because it's just so cheap. It's something's like 2 hours to implement, we'll just implement it and try it out with the customer. But if something's going to take 2 weeks, or there's a lot of room for experimentation, we'll put together like a day prototype, and learn like tremendous amount, and we throw it away. That code is just tossed, right? It doesn't have to pass tests, it's just like tossed. Now, the big takeaway I would say is like from this is like it's not I told a nice story about how we save ourselves a bunch of time by doing experimenting with something like less than production ready code, right? But that for me is not the big takeaway. The big takeaway was I asked people at stand up yesterday, because this happened like 2 years ago. I asked people at stand up yesterday, does anyone remember who like what we invalidated? What was it that we invalidated? Because we all remember this, And Andrew worked with Eric that day and spent the whole day on the demo. And Andrew, there was 7 of us, and I even emailed Eric. Eric's no longer the company, but I emailed him, and no one could come to a consensus on like what we actually learned. And some people just didn't remember. Some people are like, oh, this was what actually we invalidated. And like, no, we definitely did not invalidate that. I worked on that, and even the guy who worked on it, like Andrew, like he didn't remember. Okay. And so, why do I tell that? Because holding ourselves to account means that we can actually communicate and express our learnings and lessons. Okay. And the key from lean startup is you need to be explicit about your hypotheses and what your method of learning and what actually happened, how you're going to measure, what the actual measurements were, and what your insights were. So it's not sufficient just to gain the outcomes, right? This is working with this level of discipline is like a different way of working. It leads to a different like mindset, and the mindset is always like pace, which is if you put in a year to learn something, could you have put in just 6 months to learn the same thing? Could you have put in 3 months? Could you put in 1 month? Could you put in a day? Right? So that is what we want to do. We never want to put in like more time than is necessary to acquire the lessons. And the thing is like my team, I don't know how we can like hold ourselves account, or we can't give an account, for our lessons. So what are the measurements? What were our hypotheses? Did we capture the lessons? Right? So there's an opportunity for us. One of the things like I do is I keep a metrics journal. And this metrics journal is like every day I track certain things. So I started in like February 2019. And here's March 2019. But you can see, if you can see here, like there's certain times, and those are the times I go to sleep. So you can see like 1:30, 12:30, 11:30, 2:30. So the thing that I'm trying in my journal is I don't want to go to sleep that late. Now, if you look at February, you can see I'm consistently sleeping like 10 o'clock is when I go to bed, except for board game nights, because board game nights I stay up late, right? So you can, 12:30 is when I go to bed. Now, that's a dramatic difference, but I would never have gotten that difference without like actual measurement. And that was, I started this 2 years ago, and most of that, what it shows is an account where I'm fully aware, like I have huge self-awareness over my state, and I can see the state where it's like unacceptable to me. And I can just constantly try new things. So, each column in here is an experiment, and I just experiment with things until I can get like the results that I want, right? So I can give an account of my sleep habits, and much more is like what I track in my metrics journal. So can we give an account of our own work? And one of the things I challenge you is, on a personal level, at work level, at team level, can you give an account of your work and your lessons? So one of the things I want to talk about, the other thing I want to talk about is continuous delivery. So continuous delivery comes about at the same time, around 2010, we have continuous delivery kind of comes out, and it grows into the DevOps movement. And you have to understand, like, one pattern or theme of software development is just the pace, the pace of change. So, I talked about how we were like 21 months late on something, and that pace of change is just ridiculous. That's not a starter. And when Agile was first coming out, people were talking about like 1 month iterations. No one talks about that anymore. But continuous delivery and DevOps, they're talking about how do you actually deploy hundreds of times per day. So that's like how the technical community has just kind of like advanced, right? So that's a totally different set of pace. That's not Agile anymore. I mean, some people consider it like a natural extension of Agile, but it's not Agile in terms of like, when people think of Agile as kind of like Scrum and extreme programming. That's a whole new set of it's a whole new set of scale. So one of the things I think about in terms of framing is you need to understand like what methodology you want to use.
We're going.
Okay.
Goodbye.
All right, bye, buddy. Love you.
Who's eating a flower right
Ethan,
now?
You gotta go. So you have to think about each of these things.
Bye, Daddy.
Bye, buddy. You have to think of each of these methodologies in terms of like, they're just tools. They're tools that are appropriate for a certain context. Okay. Now, the waterfall context, which is like low business uncertainty and low process uncertainty, that doesn't exist. That world exists no longer. Okay. And if you look at Agile, Agile is, how do you actually do sustainable feature delivery? And if you look at these things, I've laid them out chronologically in terms of how they came about, right? Waterfall came first, then Agile, Lean Startup, and continuous delivery. But if you look at them in terms of how you proceed, in terms of where your business is at, Lean Startup actually comes first, right? This is where you're actually, you're doing customer discovery. You do not know if you're building the right thing. And there's a whole set of like practices. Now, the thing to understand is, from this, is like Agile is not enough. You always have to have the mind frame in your team of what context is my team working in? And you take the tools and the practices and the ideas that are appropriate for your context. So, okay, so the last thing that I want to say is a word about values. So I talked about kind of the two agile failure modes. All right. So the thing that I see is there's two ways to detect whether your team is healthy or strong team, and you can just notice it in yourself with a feeling, and whether there's like cynicism or complaining, and you should be like reacting to those two things. Okay, and by reacting, what I mean is you should confront them, like really confront those two things. And so, recently I heard somebody say, "Oh, we were talking about why does a customer want this feature?" And somebody said, "Oh, because they don't trust their people." And so for me, that was a sign of cynicism, because it's assuming like worst intention. Like with the customer, does the customer actually use those words? Do they say, "I don't trust my people"? If they do, then yeah, they don't trust their people. But I have a hard time saying the customer would actually use those words. So what it meant is we're actually attributing like bad intentions to them. So whenever I feel cynicism within myself, like my first reaction to that was like, it's not, "Oh man, our customers suck," right? My reaction to that is, "Oh man, we don't understand our customer," right? We don't actually understand their perspective and the challenges they're encountering, because that's probably not how they would describe their pain points or why they think this feature is like solving a problem for them, right? The other thing is like complaining. So anytime I notice, and I have these behaviors within myself, right? So anytime I notice like, "Oh man, I wish this weren't a certain way. I wish these people would like understand like that they need to change things for me." So these two things, just confront them. If you feel there's a problem, you have the ability to express it, to ask for help, or to figure out what it would need to, how you can change that for yourself and for your team. There are 5 things that I put here as kind of like personal values, and these don't correspond to agile values, but this is something that I feel is what I value, and I think kind of like characterize strong teams, and something to like see how does your team, what's your team's attitude to these 5 things, right? So learning, software development, working in teams, working with people, working in complex, ambiguous spaces, you have to be continuously learning. So are people like hungry to learn? Do they want to work with each other? Are they excited about working with each other? There's some people who are not interested in learning. There's some people who are like not interested in working with other people, right? Angst. Are people sensitive to angst? Does it motivate them to do something? Like, I love angst. It's such a strong signal for that. Oh, I need to voice something. Like, I'm getting angst. It's because, is there a lack of integrity? Am I recognizing something implicit that we're agreeing to, but I'm like, it doesn't like jive with me? Am I saying something, but it doesn't match how I actually feel? So angst is like very motivational for me. Challenge. How do people approach challenge? How do people approach when something is new that's outside of their comfort zone, outside of like their explicit responsibility, their specialty? How do they meet that? Do they embrace challenge? Ease. Are people relentless about making their environment efficient and effective? So these are things that I value and I find like strongly motivating. So I'm going to end with like a challenge, and this is a challenge that Eric gave my team. Like, because 3 years ago my team sucked, it was really not a good team. My team, I love my team now. I think it's a very effective team. But 3 years ago, it was a shitty team. Now, Eric, he gave a team a challenge, and the challenge he gave the team is he's a hypothesis, and the hypothesis is that PM2 is the best team. So we're called OSP1 now, but back then it was like PM2, and he's like, PM2 is the best team, and he's like, that's the hypothesis. How do we validate that? And I'm going to ask you, how do you validate that your team is the best team and the best team at Nulogy? And how do you demonstrate or show an account of it a year from now, or 6 months from now, or 1 month from now? Thank you.